monitor folks online and then have them stick around. So they'll be able to Good evening. Welcome to the New York Studio School's Fall 2022 Evening Lecture Series. I'm Kara Carmack, the Exhibitions and Public Programs Officer, and we're thrilled to be joined by our guest this evening, curator Matthew Affron, who will be speaking on Matisse in the 1930s. Thanks to those of you joining us virtually and on 8th Street. Before we begin, I would like to note that the New York Studio School Evening Lecture Series is free to the public with support from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Robert Lehman Foundation, and many individual contributors like you. Please consider making a donation to help keep our evening lecture series free by clicking on the support button on our homepage. For our Zoom audience, I would like to point out the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to type in a question at any point during the talk. If you are on YouTube, enter your questions into the comment section. We look forward to a lively Q&A after Matthew's presentation. Now I'm delighted to introduce Matthew Affron, who is the Muriel and Philip Berman Curator of Modern Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Since coming to the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 2013, Affron has been a curator or co-curator of exhibitions, including Matisse in the 1930s, traveling to the Musée de l'Orangerie in Paris and the Musée Matisse Nice in 2022-23, the Essential Duchamp presented in 2018-19 at the Tokyo National Museum, the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Seoul, and the Art Gallery of New South Wales in Sydney. And Paint the Revolution, Mexican Modernism 1910 to 1950, which traveled to the Museo del Palacio de Bellas Artes in Mexico City and the Museum of Fine Arts Houston in 2016 and 2017. He also serves as project director for the Duchamp Research Portal, an online platform that aggregates digitized archive holdings and museum collections related to Marcel Duchamp. He has contributed essays and exhibition catalogs and edited volumes dealing with many aspects of Cubism, abstract art, surrealism, and other topics in modern art. Affron holds a BA from Brown University and a PhD from Yale University. Before joining the Philadelphia Museum of Art, he was Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Virginia and curator at its art museum. Among his many exhibitions there were Joseph Cornell and Surrealism in collaboration with the Musée des Beaux-Arts de Lyon, 2013-2014, Matisse, Picasso, and Modern Art in Paris, the T. Catesby Jones collection in collaboration with the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond from 2009 and 2010, and Fernand Léger, Contrasts of Forms, which traveled to Harvard University's Fogg Art Museum in 2007. Now please join me in offering a very warm welcome to Matthew.
Well, good evening. It's a great pleasure and honor to be speaking at the Studio School, and I want to also thank Kara for organizing this talk. Can you hear me? Yeah? I'm going to just launch into it by way of this photograph and a short word about the project that I'm discussing today. This slide also functions as a reminder to me to do a very brief advertising pitch, and that is that everyone should come to Philadelphia and see this exhibition before the end of January, because you need to see it in person. So we look forward to seeing you there. But in any case, the project is, as you can see on the screen, co-organized with the Musée de l'Orangerie and the Musée Matisse Nice, Cécile Debray and Claudine Gramont, my co-curators, and I began it in 2017 with the concept of doing the first exhibition about a transformative decade in the career of Matisse. Transformative how? Well, this was a decade in which Matisse reassessed his subjects, expanded his techniques and materials, and deepened his thinking about his artistic method. And I'll say some things about that as we go along. One advantage of Philadelphia also was that the story had a local dimension for us at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, because the catalyst, the thing that precipitated the changes that came in the 30s decade, is the Philadelphia Monument, the great dance mural for the Barnes Foundation, executed in 1932 and 1933. And in the photograph by a German photographer named Wolfgang Veneman that you see on the screen, you have Matisse standing in front of a bit of that mural. You see Matisse, you see one of the monumental female figures under one of the pendentives in the upper part of the wall under the ceiling at the Barnes Foundation. But this is not in Marion, where the picture was first installed. And that's not real architecture, that's paper, that architectural element that is behind him, because this photograph was taken in Nice in the empty automobile garage that Matisse used as a studio to execute the massive 45-foot wide composition. But I like it because it's a beautiful photo, and it's staged so that the shadow on the wall has Matisse looking up at the lady that he's painted. So that's a good hook for a PMA for this show. One of the reasons why this exhibition had to happen in Philadelphia, but also we tell the story of the decade broadly and comprehensively. The checklist that comprises some 140 works, including some 45 paintings, 50-something drawings, 20 prints, 7 illustrated books, 8 bronzes, photographs, 2 films, and 1 skirt, which is the posing skirt for one of the great pictures in our collection called Woman in Blue, which I'll get to later. To get into the story, I'm offering you this comparison. Matisse traveled to the USA in the autumn of 1930 to serve as a juror for the annual Carnegie International Contemporary Art Prize, which he had won first prize in a few years before. At this stage, at the end of 1930, just past his 60th birthday, Matisse had both international recognition and commercial success. And you see him standing with Barnes, the taller of the two people in the slide on the left, in front of a painting by Renoir from the 1890s in the Barnes Foundation main gallery. And on the right, you see one of the things that drew Matisse to the Barnes Foundation in 1930, and that was to see some of his own great works, in addition to other great works of French modern art. The Joy of Life from 1905 to 06, which then was displayed in the stairwell between 2 modern tapestries, one by Rouault and one by Picasso. We'll get to tapestry later also. That painting now in the new Barnes Foundation on the Parkway in Philadelphia is displayed in a second-floor mezzanine gallery. So Matisse had international recognition and success, and some of his great works were in important collections such as the Barnes Foundation, but a different reality was hidden behind the image, because since 1928, 2 years before, Matisse has succeeded in making very few pictures. He was in a very deep creative slump. So from Pittsburgh, he makes a side trip to Marion in the suburbs of Philadelphia, which is where the Barnes Foundation was then, to see the foundation, including the Joy of Life, this painting with a subject from classical Arcadia, signifying nostalgia for a carefree life in a faraway golden age of humanity, figures making music and dancing in a landscape, but painted in a very jarring style, which made it such a signature work when it was first shown in Paris, and then also when it was seen at the Barnes. For our purposes, what you can barely see in the far middle ground, the dynamic circle of female dancers at the center of this rhythmic composition is important to point out. I'm going to show you now a series of images which sample some of the works in the exhibition, and the titles of the 7 sections of the show are in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. The exhibition, Matisse in the 1930s, tells the story of the decade in 7 sections or galleries, but we get a running start on the main storyline with a section called Interiors and Odalisques, which begins in 1917, which is an important date in Matisse's career. After having established his reputation in Paris in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, Matisse shifted his base of operations to the city of Nice on the French Riviera. What kept him in Nice for the rest of his life, he said to one of his painter friends, Charles Camoin, one of the early Fauve painters, was the tender brilliance of the Mediterranean light. Interior at Nice, the picture on the left, 1917 to 1918, might be the first picture he painted after arriving in Nice, and it exemplifies this attention to studio light, because this is the room where he lived but also worked, so it was a studio. This light which brightens the lace curtains, which brightens the panes of the windows and the interior. Throughout the 20s, Matisse was a painter primarily of those spaces where he lived and worked as self-contained environments cut off from the world at large. He used the control setting of the studio to focus on the visual pleasure of that studio light, which gives a certain kind of modeling and a certain kind of depth to the imagery, and the colors and patterns of objects and the furnishings, and the allure of the paid female models with whom he worked daily, as in the picture called The Moorish Screen, also in the PMA's collection, where you see a pair of models in fashionable white and pink dresses with no definite activity beyond their pose. And they established a leisurely psychological atmosphere, while around them, the space of the room fills with the colors and patterns of wallpapers and rugs, and a cotton tapestry on a wooden frame, which imitates fretwork screens typical of Islamic architecture called Haiti. And that's what gives the picture its title. Matisse's art in Nice in the 20s makes a strong connection between evocative depictions of the studio interior and interiority, or an interior world existing in our perceptions, our feelings. The idea of escaping from ordinary reality into a fantasy is nowhere stronger than in the long series of odalisque pictures he made between 1921 and 1928, and a great example from the Musée de l'Orangerie, one of our exhibition partners, is on the left. That term odalisque refers to enslaved women or concubines living in the female quarters of some elite Muslim households. Also, of course, refers to a genre of French painting in the 19th century, depicting those kinds of figures in those kinds of settings. Matisse picked up on that tradition, transforming his European models into pseudo-odalisques with loose-fitting pantaloons and caftans and turbans, and having them pose in an imaginary harem-like ambiance he conjured in his studio with textiles and furniture and decorative arts made in Islamic cultures, which he admired greatly, having seen those objects in museum exhibitions and in his travels to North Africa. He borrowed the repeat patterns of those Islamic world objects as a source of visual pleasure and as an expression of luxuriance and sensuality. And the odalisque with gray trousers makes that connection very strong. Notice also that compared to the picture on the right, which you saw before, you see Matisse getting a little bit more broad in his conception or his painting of the patterns, less delicate and more restless. He's starting to move out of the delicate mode of the earlier picture, but that won't happen really till the 30s. Now, at this point, you're wondering, why am I starting with the 1920s if this is a show called Matisse in the 30s? It's to signpost a number of interrelated issues that run through the subsequent decade, which is the focus of the exhibition, and which I think you need to understand so that you can see what happens when things change over the threshold of 1930 in some respects. Those constants are the primacy for Matisse of the human figure, his focus on the model in the studio, his focus on sensuality and the interplay of the eroticized body with the environment, and the concept of decoration as a baseline for Matisse's art. Pictures like these exemplify a decorative aesthetic, which would be no less important in the 30s. And yet, by the 20s, Matisse felt that this vein of work had more or less given out, had been exhausted. And that's when he fell into the slump and really gave up easel painting for a number of years, working in other mediums. and pondering where he was to go. And that's where the Barnes Commission comes in. Albert Barnes offered the commission because he wanted a capstone for his building by the artist who he thought was the greatest living exponent of the French modern art tradition. And when I say capstone, I mean a building, I mean a picture unlike the others in his collection that would be made for a specific site and not portable and really decorative in its intention for the main gallery. And you're seeing a photograph taken from the mezzanine above between the columns, showing you one of the empty lunettes that Matisse's work would fill. This was around 1928, when it was finally installed in 1933. Matisse, on the other hand, wanted a challenging project as a way to stand up to the weight of his own past and as a way to lay the foundations for what he would do next in his career. He was given free rein in his subject matter, Matisse, and so he went back to the Arcadian golden age subject of a round of dancing figures, which was important in the Joy of Life picture, and also in the great dance decorative panel for the Russian collector Shukin from 1909. And he used that as the basis for what he would do in the Barnes Foundation. That's the focus of the first section, along with the other great commission that Matisse worked on in the beginning of the 30s, his first great illustrated book, an edition of Mallarmé's poems. And one of the themes of the exhibition is how Matisse became a great book artist in the 30s and how he used books as a kind of generator of new motifs for his art. In any case, though we tried to borrow the alternate version of the Barnes mural from the Modern Art Museum in Paris, we failed. And so instead, we use a great selection of oil sketches and in-process photographs and watercolors and other ancillary materials to trace the genesis of the mural on the wall in our galleries. And we also have the extraordinary loan of an 11-foot tall, full-sized oil study for the central figure in the mural from the Musée Matisse Nice to give a sense of scale in the galleries. This section allows us to tell our audience something about the importance of the decorative aesthetic and how it was rethought by Matisse in the course of making the Barnes mural. What do I mean? I mean, Matisse already thought hard about the decorative in terms of the easel picture, but he thought the easel pictures were a closed world, isolated from the milieu by means of the frame, and demanding scrutiny in close proximity and with focused concentration, and communicating with the viewer on an individual level. Whereas he thought things were reversed with architectural painting, like the Barnes Dance. His first opportunity in his career to make a mural for a specific architectural site, in this case, the awkward space, 45 feet wide, over the 3 French doors and under the half-moon lunettes under the ceiling in Marion. Things were reversed for him in architectural painting, where the purpose of the picture was to animate a space. Matisse spoke of his painted decoration as functioning in its placement over those 3 doors, like the pediment on a cathedral porch. And this analogy served to underline his idea of the total integration of the image with its setting as an issue of paramount importance when you're talking about decorative painting. Moving on. Matisse was not immediately sure, even after he installed the Barnes mural in the spring of 1933 in its destination, of his path forward. He found that path in 1935. He began by setting up a daily work routine with a new model, Lydia Delektorskaya, a Russian emigre in Nice, who actually met him because he hired her for 6 months to serve an assistant on the making of the Barnes mural. For 2 years, beginning in 1935, he focused with Lydia on the theme of the nude model in the studio, working in a style like the style of the great large reclining nude from Baltimore, which I'm very happy to say we have in the exhibition, in a style which he described to a journalist as moving away from refinement, think the style of the 20s, and toward bolder, more elemental effects. This is the classic example, the picture on the right, which began in May 1935, and you can't see it, but it's the first of the in-process photographs which were taken and which he used as a kind of roadmap to his creative process, and sometimes showed to people visiting his studio, and even sometimes published, because he made a habit of doing this, using photography this way throughout the decade. He began with a more standard image, an image painted in a more standard way of a model in a classic pose, lying on a couch with one elbow raised, with a vase of flowers on a chair and a back wall on the diagonal. And then he ended up 6 months later with the painting that you see on the right. The making of this picture involved two procedures that were borrowed from and which had contributed to Matisse's reinvention of his approach with the Barnes mural and then imported into easel pictures. First of all, it's the use of the camera to record the sequence of formal adjustments that radically simplified the form of the body and merged the figure with the background, as you see here. The second, whose traces are visible because in a number of small pinholes that you see in the upper left-hand corner of the canvas, was the use of pieces of pre-colored cut paper to plan the composition before it was painted. Matisse used that procedure to make and to revise the dance mural as an expedient, cut papers covering the entire mural so that he could make changes without having to repaint the whole thing at every turn, obviously impossible at that scale. But he kept that for smaller easel pictures, I think, because he liked the bold, flat, expansive style that that technique suggested. Now, in a gallery in the exhibition devoted to paintings and drawings of the nude model, this picture, the centerpiece of it, highlights an obvious question. Why did Matisse repeatedly paint and draw the female nude figure so insistently at this turning point in the middle of the 30s? For Matisse, in some sense, his artistry could not exist without the direct presence of the model. He believed that the pleasure he took in responding to the model's naked or semi-clothed or clothed body was indispensable for firing his imagination. And he used that idea as a subject for an extended inquiry into the nature of his own artistry. The goal of his art by his lights was to capture the sensuousness of his subject matter, whether it was a still life, a landscape, or the human body, but copying its appearance was not enough. His stated aim was to express his deep emotional response to the model through the materials of art, paint, charcoal, or ink. This meant diverting attention to the sensuality of the composition as a whole. Obviously, whether or not this process was yet another way to see the female body as another object in the composition, or to reimagine its powerful presence as art, or both, was a question then and is a question now. Section also focuses on a number of wonderful drawings and says something about the increasing importance of drawing in Matisse's art in the middle of the 30s. Drawing made a very direct statement, whether in unshaded ink drawings, like the wonderful drawing from the Pompidou Center from 1937 on the left, or charcoal drawings from the MoMA on the right. Drawing made a vivid statement of a larger Matissean idea of a duality between direct experience on the one hand, which he felt was crucial to everything he did, and the highly organized expression of the motif on the other, in the ink drawing in a flowing arabesque, in the charcoal drawing, in the use of a stump to establish and then rub out and then redraw and sort of work the image and then keep a record of its working visible there. And a remarkable, in this case, in the MoMA drawing, investigation of angular forms instead of sinuous contours. Now, if our premise in the exhibition is that the Barnes dance changed the direction of Matisse's art, the next obvious question for the next section is this. What was his involvement with large-scale, architecturally oriented formats afterwards? It turns out that Matisse lost little time in finding new ways to engage with decorative formats, those beyond the scope of portable easel-sized painting, starting with a commission from a decorative arts entrepreneur and art dealer named Marie Coutoli, who was interested in trying to revive the traditional French tapestry industry by commissioning designs, cartoons, full-scale designs, paintings that could serve as full-scale designs for weavers, that would be brought to the workshop to be turned into ink and wool tapestries. As a type of mobile mural or architectural decoration, tapestry seemed a natural fit for Matisse's ideas about the decorative image. And so he took an etching from his Mallarmé book showing a view onto the harbor of the capital of Tahiti, where he had gone in 1930 to get away when he was at his low point. And he turned it into first a oil painting about six or 7 feet tall, full-size sketch for a tapestry, as you see here, and then redid it in the presumably more tapestry-friendly because flatter medium of gouache right afterwards in the second version there. The tip-off that these are painted tapestry cartoons partly is in the use of the internal border, which is full of Tahitian gardenia flowers. And then he engaged in an even larger tapestry-like painting project based on an image also for the Mallarmé book, translated into something else, an illustration for the famous poem by Mallarmé called Afternoon of a Faun, where you have the half-goat, half-human faun, in this case serenading the nymph, the Roman personification of nature, with his flute to express his desire for her. Matisse worked this subject up in a remarkable series of images, which we have in the exhibition. One of them is this amazing 5-foot wide square charcoal drawing on canvas called Faun Charming the Sleeping Nymph, 1935. It's a very strange picture. I think of it because of its square format and its large size and its charcoal as a work with a kind of decorative intention, thinking that charcoal is sometimes a medium for mural sketches. In any case, that's one of the pictures which he used to scale up that book plate to something else. And then finally, he imported into a work that he worked on for about 8 years off and on, a very experimental work, very sketch-like, very, very, very brutal in some ways in its color contrasts. Picture again in a tapestry format called Nymph in the Forest on the other side. Again, remarkable for its sketch-like drawing and its bright, unmixed palette, Matisse was quoted to the effect in 1936 that when one's methods become too refined, it's time to regress to the basics of pictorial language. It's time to recover, quote, the purity of one's means. And I think that's the experiment that he undertook in the Nymph in the Forest, getting back to the purity of his means. And you could read that in the perspective of the 20s. When one becomes too refined, one moves to something a little bit more direct. Nymph in the Forest was undeniably important in these terms, but the two Tahiti pictures and this picture on the right were shown only once at the time in an exhibition at his dealer's gallery in Paris, Paul Rosenberg's gallery, in 1936, among more regular-sized portable pictures that Matisse had made in those years. And then he went back into his studio, because I think he valued them most as experiments for his own contemplation and as elements of the decor of the place where he worked. But, and this moves us to the next section, these painted decorations, which were the follow-up in some way to the Barnes mural in different terms, also had a second life because they begin popping up in the backgrounds of further pictures of female models in the studio. Oops. Not these actually, but others. The next section is about a new series that Matisse began in 1936 of models and interiors, all wearing garments, brightly decorated garments from a stock that he maintained as part of his studio paraphernalia, costumes. This is the fashion section of the exhibition. He also filled his studio with flowers and bouquets and tropical plants. And the tropical plants turned the studio into something like a winter garden. And that's why the section is called the Winter Garden. And in his paintings, he transposed the forms of his models and the accessories they wore and the embellishments of their costumes and the exuberant forms of those bouquets and philodendrons with large stalks and leaves into an amazingly changeable visual shorthand in rhythmic line and bold color. This section makes a kind of bookend with the series of nudes in the section before, and it also gives us a chance to say something more in the exhibition and more precise about the nature of Matisse's pictorial experiment in this period. Let me repeat something I said before, or alluded to before, about the style of the mid-30s nudes. Matisse moved in the mid-30s to a new style of bold, flat shapes and bright, unshaded colors. He moved towards clarity of design. He moved towards maximized impact and expansion of form and space. And then he explored a very diverse constellation of expressive avenues within that larger attitude. For example, Woman in Blue, one of the great pictures in the PMA collection, is the high point in a subgroup focusing on a garment in blue silk with a matching skirt, which Lydia Delektorskaya, his main model in this period, actually fabricated at his request as a studio prop. And she's wearing it in the picture there. Henry McElhaney, the decorative arts curator at PMA from the 30s to the 60s and a collector and donor to the museum, purchased Matisse's Woman in Blue through the dealer Paul Rosenberg and then gave it to his sister, later president of the museum in Philadelphia, who later donated it to the museum. In the 40s or 50s, he delivered a lecture at the Philadelphia Print Club where he gave some anecdotes about all this, about the picture on the left, Woman in Blue. July 4th, 1937, Paul Rosenberg, the dealer, invites McElhaney to lunch with Matisse, Georges Braque, and Mary Laurencin in the Bois de Boulogne in Paris. They chat. Maurice Chevalier, the film actor, arrives and sits at the next table with a blonde. The three artists are enchanted, and they spend the rest of the lunch watching Chevalier. Riding a taxi the same summer in 1937, later, McElhaney asks Matisse for a suggestion of a good picture because his mother wants to buy one for his sister. Matisse strongly recommends Woman in Blue, saying it was his best picture of 1937, quote, the most solidly painted and the work on which he spent the most time and care. And McElhaney says, we followed his advice. Most solidly painted. Well, this is a picture which takes the idea of distilled forms, flattened space, rhythmic pattern, symmetry, every element in correlation or mutual relationship with every other, and an important step in this period for Matisse, the pulling apart in a sense of color and design by painting in broad areas and then not drawing so much as incising maybe with the back of his brush the lines into the paint. That's the principle of this picture. Whereas, for example, in a wonderful picture 2 years later in the Art Studio Chicago, Daisies, he depicts a model with whom he worked in Paris in that summer, 39, in a borrowed studio, the studio of a sculptor named Mary Callery, an American sculptor who lived in New York. And he places the model in the red chair alongside the titular bouquet and a glazed earthenware jar from Tunisia and some lemons on a sculpture stand and a drawing of the model over her head, also solidly painted, but so differently painted, with maybe a greater player tension between illusionistic depth on the one hand and flatness on the other. Matisse spoke of his work in this period as having a sign-like character. By this he meant, I think, though the image always had a certain representational link to what he saw before him, principally things in the studio and people, finally the picture had to be a world apart, defined by highly organized pictorial energies and a shorthand or an approximation of the people and the things in the space, highlighting heightened feeling for space and form. One more example from the series, a great painting in an unusual format in the last decorative large-scale picture in the show, an overmantel picture with a notch in the bottom to fit around a fireplace, showing not one, but not two, but four models in brightly colored garments, and the sinuous arabesque lines of their bodies making the energy of the design with those large plants in the background. This was painted as a commission for a Fifth Avenue apartment by Nelson Rockefeller. And there you see a photograph of the wood paneled room with a space for the overmantel and Matisse's notations for the eventual work. This is about 8 feet tall, almost floor to ceiling, and it's a kind of centerpiece of a wonderful gallery with a whole panoply of women in these costumes that we have in the exhibition. It's time to start thinking about how to tell you about how we close the storyline of the show, and for me to start thinking about how to close my remarks here. Because the section of women in decorated outfits takes you to 1940 and the end of the decade. And so we need to signpost our graceful exit with two sections. A small penultimate section takes us out of Matisse's studio to a theater in Monte Carlo, and eventually a theater in Chicago, and a dance performance. This section also calls back to section 2 of the exhibition by demonstrating that the subject of the Barnes dance continued to have a continuing impact on Matisse's artistic imagination from the beginning of the decade to the end of it. What do I mean? In 1937, 38, and 39, Matisse collaborated with the artistic director of the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo dance troupe, an important modern dance company with a long track record of doing collaborations for sets and costumes with prominent modern artists. This is going back to the days of Diaghilev, just after World War I. Now, Leonid Messine was the director of the Ballet Russe, and they were now based in Monaco, not far from Nice. Messine also had seen the Barnes dance mural in Matisse's studio in Nice, where it had been painted, and Messine had said, we must work together. Kind of a no-brainer, an immense decoration on the theme of dance, developing dance themes that run all the way back through Matisse's career. Ultimately, Matisse agreed, and he and Messine collaborated on a dance called Red and Black. Alternate title, Strange Farandole. Farandole being the name of a rustic round dance that Matisse actually had seen danced at a Parisian dance hall when he was young and was sketching, and which had stuck in his mind, and which he had introduced into the far middle ground of The Joy of Life, and which he had painted in the decorative panel for Chouquin, and then in subsequent still lives with the dance in the studio behind. And there's a great example at MoMA of that, and which he then went back to in a different form to make the decoration under the 3 lunettes for the Barnes Foundation, and which now, with Messine, he went back to for a new kind of expressive, collaborative, artistic project in a different medium. So they co-wrote a sort of minimal scenario for the dance called Red and Black. Messine decided to use Shostakovich's first symphony as the music. The choreography is lost, but I think it was inspired by the music, and also by Matisse's backdrop and costumes. Costumes very modern, bodysuits with flame-like designs in 6 colors that were given allegorical meaning in the scenario of the ballet, and a backdrop, which you see in the photograph on the right, in 3 great arches, which are the arches of the Barnes Foundation. Thank you very much. Turned into a dance backdrop. Amazingly, there is a Ballet Russe backdrop collection, including a fragment of this, at Butler University in Indianapolis. But that's another story. I did not try to borrow it. And no dancers in the backdrop, because the dancers are the live dancers. In this photograph, made in Monaco around the premiere, dancers making shapes on stage. And that's how apparently this dance was most effective, with dancers making shapes in these bright colors against the backdrop. Interestingly, and we illustrate this project with that photograph and related works. Interestingly, Matisse decided, while making studies for his concept of these dancing figures in the ballet, he made studies using colored cut papers, the medium which had been an expedient in the making of the Barnes mural for composing the design without having to repaint the whole thing, and which he retained even in making smaller sized easel-sized pictures, I think because he liked the bold effects that they promoted. He made some studies which did not need to be painted, which simply are works on paper, in cut papers of dancers. These are some wonderful loans that we have in the exhibition. The white figure tumbling in the study called Two Dancers from 1937 to 1938 on the left-hand side, is basically one of the figures in the Barnes mural in the center, where there are the two tumbling figures. That makes the link. Now in the exhibition, we tell the story. We have some studies like these and some others, but we also have, I can't show it to you. We also have about a 10-minute film made by an American dance critic who made films of traveling dance companies on tour. The Ballet went to Chicago in '39, just before the war, or just as the war was breaking out. And so we present very large as a projection, I think for the first time anywhere or in any Matisse exhibition, this extract from The Lost Dance with the music. And I promise you, everybody loves this. They sit, they watch the whole thing. Come to Philadelphia, and you'll see this sort of never before seen a version of this great project. So that's one of the ways that we close the story. The exhibition really closes with another major turning point in Matisse's life and art, making a parenthesis with the beginning, right? If there's a turning point in 1917 when he moves to Nice, and a turning point in Nice when he receives the commission that will break him out of that slump that he had at the end of the 20s. In 1941, there's also another great turning point in his life. He's now nearly 70 years old. World War II has broken out. He decides to stay in France in Nice, and he intends to work through the hostilities. But he falls ill with cancer and undergoes a very risky, ultimately life-saving operation in the city of Lyon. Back in Nice in 1941 and 42, he does a lot of drawing, some painting, but a lot of drawing. And the last gallery has a few paintings and two great series of drawings of the type that you see on the wall here. The result of all this drawing is a corpus known as Themes and Variations. It consists of 158 drawings divided into 17 suites with just two subjects, women in the interior seated, and tabletop still lives. Example, Suite P, and you're seeing two of the drawings from this suite, the first and the third. Suite P, because they're all given, they're all identified with letters of the alphabet and then numbered afterwards. Suite P shows a model in a pleated dress, a striped dress, in a variety of poses and from a variety of viewpoints. Like most of the other suites, it starts with a matrix drawing in charcoal executed over several sessions, the function of which was to help Matisse get to know the motif, get it in his head. The visible changes, again, a record of the process of getting to know it. Right? I focus on drawing in this exhibition partly because I think drawings illustrate how much Matisse was an artist self-conscious about his process. And he used certain kinds of drawing and certain techniques of drawing to reveal his process in a certain sense on the surface of the work. Each suite then continues with a certain number of variations, other drawings, in pencil or pen and ink, all executed more spontaneously, all an unshaded line drawing in a more flowing improvisational line with no possibility of correction. Each variation, both a concise distillation of the theme drawing and a new version of the drawing that came before. The drawings can have a kind of casual look, but Matisse was convinced of their importance. So in the depths of the war, he had his Paris publisher publish a book, an album of loose leaf, full page, photomechanical reproductions, not a luxury book like the Mallarmé book, a didactic publication whose purpose was to shed light on Matisse's artistic method and creative process. Again, because I think his self-consciousness about method is important, and he's also, I think, wanting to mark where he is as an artist at this point, as the 30s turn to the 40s, which is why I think this is an appropriate way to end the exhibition. And I think it's interesting that it's in drawing that Matisse feels he has sort of gotten to where he is at that particular place. So this section focusing on two suites of themes of variations, this one and another one from the museum in Bordeaux, which is a still life suite. As a kind of epilogue, marks where Matisse has come as an artist at this turning point. In terms of style first, the drawings exemplify the condensed, clear-cut manner that Matisse developed in many mediums over the 30s. In terms of method, these drawings sum up how Matisse thought of a duality between the deliberate observation of the subject on one hand and a process of creation in a deeper, more improvisational state of mind on the other. The themes and variations exemplify something that you see throughout the whole exhibition, which is Matisse's interest in working iteratively, making multiple versions of a single motif to intensify his expression of that motif. And finally, these works encapsulate a reflection on the process of creation. They confirm that what interested Matisse most of all at this time was the open-ended flux of creation, of inspiration, and his preference at this turning point for a complex creative process over the finished work. The themes and variations needed to close the exhibition because they crystallized the Matissian theme of process, which is one of the key themes of the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's really wonderful. Do we have any questions here in the audience? In the room, and I'll be checking our guests.
Hi, sort of figuring this out as I say it, but so I had a simple question, which was, you mentioned Matisse being inspired by, assume Thomas Mallory book.
Mallarmé.
Oh.
Stéphane Mallarmé.
And was that?
Sorry, I mumbled that.
No, that's okay.
Didn't mean to.
That makes more sense.
The symbolist poet of the late 19th century.
And so it wasn't illustration, it was the text, the imagery of the text that you...
That is a really interesting question that I would like to answer because it really pertains to Matisse's work as a book artist in general. So again, it's remarkable. Matisse, he had been involved in some book projects before, but he became a designer of books at this moment in 1930 at around 60 years of age. And over the rest of his life, he really made a great mark in that medium. The Mallarmé book is remarkable because of the degree to which he thought about the question of the relation between the image and the text. He was inspired by Mallarmé partly because Mallarmé's writing is so open-ended and so hard to pin down in some sense on purpose. He had no interest in directly illustrating the poems, with some exceptions. For example, some of his illustrations for the poem called Afternoon of a Faun. But putting that aside, what Matisse said he was doing was making decorated books, not illustrated ones. And indeed, most of the books, the images that he made, he drew on his own storehouse of imagery for something that he thought would resonate with the text, whatever it was. The second one was an illustrated edition of James Joyce's Ulysses. And there's another one in the show, which is an edition of the love poetry of the Renaissance poet Ronsard. So there's a whole variety of authors whom he read mostly, not Joyce, He went back to Homer for that one. But mostly he read them, appreciated them, and then wanted to find a way to accompany them. Because he thought that it would devalue the text, just illustrate it, and also devalue the book. And so that's a whole topic. But I interrupted you, so please.
No, I mean, that was a great answer. I guess my follow-up to that would just be simply, I mean, I had a question about Mallory, but that doesn't, which was, it's interesting to me because he sort of famously embraced decorative art, yet seemed to have a sort of different, or seemed to have a maybe a negative view of illustration as like.
I didn't hear the adjective you used. What kind of art?
Well, he sort of famously embraced like a decorative, or at least the word decorative, right?
Yes, yes.
Yet seemed to try to make, I don't know, drew more of a division between his high art books and what I guess would have been illustration for the time, or I don't know. Did he ever speak on illustrators?
Interesting question. I think this is a moment. He was involved in the rise of the luxury art book, right? With people like Albert Schira, who commissioned books from him, and others. And so that was his métier as a book artist. I think he was not interested in more traditional ideas of illustration, because his ambition for books was to have the kind of a kind of higher purpose, yes, in his terms, that all decorative things in a deeper sense have, whether they are tiny etchings, drawings, easel pictures, mural paintings, or indeed artist books.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could you say more about his use of models, as to whether when he had one model that he began with stating the theme, that he's kept that same model day after day, or did he have, for instance, the woman in a Persian dress, and so that face I don't recognize as being connected with anything else, but I could easily be wrong. So was that a casual model, or in fact, friends or visitors? Anyway, yes, could you open that up a little bit?
Yes, happy to do so. So Matisse, as I said, really became, well, I didn't say it, but that 1917 moment that we began the story with is important also because that's really when Matisse became a painter of models daily. And those pictures, of course, tread a fine line between the individual and the type, because they're not portraits in the traditional sense. The model's function is different. And I think that was very important. He went through phases of working intensively with a single model for a short period of time or for a longer period of time, some for nearly a decade. Lydia Delatorskaya, who he began working with in 1935, was his principal model throughout the decade. Then he hired a friend of hers to help sort of lighten her burden as a model, because she also was his studio assistant, secretary, and fully involved in his life in many ways. And then he would, what is said is that he would work with a model either until they left him because they no longer wanted to be employed or their life changed. Sometimes he was very unwilling for them to leave. Like there's a model named Henriette who left him at the end of the 1920s. And we have the farewell picture in our exhibition, which is a wonderful picture called Woman with a Veil from MoMA, which is clearly the most psychologically troubling picture of a model in the show, because it is a farewell picture and he wasn't happy. In other cases, the relationship just ended or something. Sometimes he had a model very briefly, because he never knew how it would work out. And he talks about this. He would say, she wasn't great. I thought it would work out, it didn't. Or I think this is promising. And there are notations in his diary or in his letters and things like that. He said that the human figure was the subject that he revered the most. He said that the model was really the center of his art. It was said to him from the start, well, but aren't you just using them as a kind of form? the way you might use another form in your painting. And he denied it. He said that there was something like a soul that was being recorded. The question, of course, is whose soul is it? Is it her soul or his soul? Which in his expression theory of art, which ultimately is what the picture contains. And I think that ambiguity is unresolvable and very important to the worldview of Matisse.
Great, thank you. We have an online question asking if Picasso's Guernica had an effect on Matisse in the 30s.
I'm glad that you have that question because it's an important one. Matisse and Picasso, of course, were friendly rivals who followed each other's work, who knew each other's work. There's a story I can tell quickly. In the earlier part of the 30s, the Rockefellers wanted to have some murals for the RCA building. And famously, they hired Diego Rivera to make a mural called Man at the Crossroads, which famously they had destroyed in medias res because Rivera did the provocative thing of including a portrait of Lenin, which took the politics too far. Actually, the Rockefellers also approached both Picasso and Matisse for murals for that same lobby at the RCA building. Picasso didn't reply, it is said. According to Alfred Barr, Picasso did not reply. And Matisse replied saying that that was not the right place for him because his art required a space of greater contemplation and greater serenity than the lobby of a Rockefeller Center building, a temple of commerce. I think Barnes made sense because it was an educational foundation and in fact not so open to the public, but in a sense a space of art. So I would say that Matisse would never have made a project like Guernica because he would not have made a political picture for a World's Fair. But that's also something that Picasso very rarely did. It was unusual for him to do. Interestingly, there was an alternate version of the Barnes mural, which Matisse kept and finished, and then tried to shop around, hoping that another collector, whether in the US or in France, would take. Ultimately, the city of Paris purchased it for that same 37 World's Fair for an art museum, which they were building for that World's Fair. And that would have been an interesting parallelism with the Guernica for the Spanish Pavilion, but it didn't happen because it took 40 years for them to finally install the dance, the alternate dance, in the building where it is today, which is the Modern Art Museum in the city of Paris. That's another story.
Thank you. I have a question. I was wondering if you could speak to the reception of these works in the 30s after that, that slump that, I don't know if it was personal or commercial or both, and then how is this kind of shift in style received?
Matisse had a good market, relatively good market during this period. He was well collected, especially in the United States, which is one reason why we have so many great works from the second half of the 30s coming from US collections, all over the US. I would say, and one of the themes of our exhibition in the French venues will be how a famous art magazine called Le Cahier d'Art actually promoted Matisse in this period. So the subject of his public image, his reception, and his market, in some sense, it will be a focus of the show when it travels to France. I would say that in general, it was felt that Matisse had a kind of rebirth in this period, and I would say that he chose the theme of the dance, an Arcadian idyllic subject about the youth of humanity, partly because it symbolized the idea of rebirth for him. He was also an artist who was very alert and aware of his market. He didn't have a primary dealer. Not even his son, Pierre Matisse, in New York, had a hold on him. And he was very savvy about dealing with the market in order to place his works. So, he was a relatively successful artist in this period, and his reputation certainly was very strong in the second half of the 30s.
Thank you. We have another kind of two-part question that's coming from our very own Karen Wilkin here at the studio school.
Hello.
First, she mentions this word decorative in French. Does it have the sort of pejorative tone that it may come across when we use it in English? And then she also wanted some clarity on, she said, didn't he say he liked having the model in the studio for the frisson? So if you could...
For the what?
For the frisson, or...
Oh, I get it. Yeah, the frisson. Yeah.
Oh, the frisson.
Yeah.
Pardon.
Yes. Well, thank you for that question. I would push back on the idea that there is a simple positive, negative valence to the word decorative in the two languages, because I think that it can also be negative in French. There's no doubt that that for some, decorative means merely decorative, means subordinate. There's also, of course, a very strong gendering to the word decorative in that kind of point of view, often meaning feminine and less important, less intellectual, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Certainly, Matisse is the kind of artist whose life was devoted to overturning that kind of valuation, that kind of hierarchy of values. He thought that the art's highest aspiration was to make works of art where the relationships of color, form, line, shape, and so forth across the canvas, that is, the decorative organization of the entire composition, was what elevated the work to a kind of higher, call it more artistic, more aesthetic, more spiritual plane. And I think that if, and in various times, let's say in the US in the 40s and 50s, Matisse was very highly valued by artists and collectors and museums, as he was, it was because that kind of idea of decoration, which some turned towards a kind of abstraction that Matisse himself would never have wanted to do for himself, had a higher reputation. In other words, his kind of decoration did have a large impact and was valued. The question of the frisson of the model is important. Yes, the eroticism of the model he felt was absolutely essential for his creative process. And that's where the erotic part of the image, which he said needed to be sublimated into the whole decorative composition, which I think is why he surrounded his models with those textiles and so forth, was undeniably fundamental for his work. And there's of course, highly gendered relationship between the male artist and the female model. He was the kind of artist who would have said that at a certain point, the roles switch. But that's a very complicated and long conversation that we don't have probably time for. But thank you for the question.
Great, we have one more question, and then we'll close out this evening. The question is, do you think Matisse felt similarly about illustrating books as did Redon, who also collaborated with Mallarmé? Redon famously said that he did not make illustrations, but rather interpretations of the book.
I think that is absolutely right on. That's what makes them consequential in this kind of framing of the whole question of the book. And I would say that it's not by accident that we're talking about painters making images to accompany, let's say, not illustrate, accompany the words of poets. There's something about the operations of language and the operations of the image, and questions of ambiguity, and questions of double meaning, and questions of ephemerality, and questions of decorative transfiguration of the tangible into something less tangible, which would probably be shared by Redon and Matisse, even though there are certainly things that also separate them. But artists in this kind of mindset, I would say, are similar.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew. We'll all need to get to Philadelphia to see this wonderful exhibition.
We look forward to it. Thank you.